Welcome back to Verified Fears, my horror family. Tonight's 11 small-town encounters will haunt you forever. Dream worked the night shift at Miller's Diner when customers started paying with decades-old coins. The security footage revealed something that made her blood freeze. Emir discovered falsified death certificates in Montana's town archives, understanding why his predecessor fled after 3 days. Most terrifying is Sonny's radio show, where callers phoned at 3:17 a.m. with warnings that weren't pranks. Ignoring them would doom everyone in Whisper Falls. These 11 tales prove small-town monsters aren't hiding in forests. They're your neighbors, sitting next to you at Sunday service, and they've been planning your fate all along. Let's begin. What would you do if you discovered your late-night customers weren't actually alive? The security footage from Miller's Diner showed empty booths during the exact hours I swore I was serving coffee to the same 3 people who visited every night at 2:47 a.m. My name is Dream, and until 6 months ago, I thought the worst thing about working the graveyard shift at Miller's Diner was staying awake until dawn. The diner sits on a desolate stretch of Highway 30 outside Millfield, Nebraska, population 847, where the nearest streetlight is 5 miles in either direction. Most nights, I'd see maybe 2 or 3 truckers pass through, grab some coffee and pie, then disappear back into the darkness. It was quiet, lonely work, but it paid my college tuition and gave me time to study between customers. Everything changed on a Tuesday night in March when the regulars started showing up. The first time I saw them, I figured they were just another group of late-night travelers. 3 people. An elderly man in a brown suit that looked like it belonged in the 1960s. A middle-aged woman wearing a floral dress despite the cold Nebraska wind. And a teenage boy in a Letterman jacket from Millfield High. They walked in together at exactly 2:47 a.m., took the same corner booth, and ordered the same things. Black coffee for the man, apple pie a la mode for the woman, and chocolate milk for the boy. What struck me as odd was how quiet they were. Most late-night customers want to chat, especially truckers looking to stay alert for the road ahead. But these 3 sat in complete silence, staring out the window at the empty highway. They paid in exact change, coins that felt unusually cold in my palm, left no tip, and walked out into the parking lot where I lost sight of them in the darkness. The next night, they returned at 2:47 a.m. sharp. Same booth, same order, same eerie silence. This time I paid closer attention to their appearance. The man's brown suit had a strange, faded quality, like fabric that had been sitting in an attic for decades. The woman's floral dress had tiny tears along the hem that I hadn't noticed before. The boy's Letterman jacket bore the name Fletcher, stitched above the breast pocket, but the stitching looked old and frayed. By the 4th night, I was genuinely unsettled. I decided to make conversation, maybe learn where they were traveling from. When I approached their table with the coffee pot, I tried to catch the man's eye. "Late night for traveling," I said, forcing a smile. "Where are you folks headed?" The man looked up at me, and I felt my breath catch. His eyes were completely colorless, not blue or gray, but the absence of color altogether, like looking into fog. He didn't respond, just stared through me as if I wasn't there. The woman and boy continued staring out the window, never acknowledging my presence. I retreated to the counter, my hands shaking as I set down the coffee pot. Something was very wrong with these people. But I couldn't put my finger on what. They looked real enough, solid enough. They ordered food and paid for it. But there was something fundamentally off about them. Something that made every instinct in my body scream danger. The pattern continued for 2 weeks. Every night at 2:47 a.m., they'd appear in the parking lot like materializing from thin air. Same booth, same order, same haunting silence. I started dreading their arrival, watching the clock as it crept toward 2:45, my stomach knotting with anxiety. Then I noticed the coins they used to pay. While cleaning up their table one night, I examined the change they'd left behind. The quarters were dated 1967, the dimes from 1965, the nickels from 1969. All of them were in pristine condition, as if they'd never been in circulation. But what really caught my attention was how cold they felt. Not just cool from being outside, but ice cold like they'd been stored in a freezer. I decided to research the dates, wondering if there was some significance. What I found made my blood run cold. A newspaper search revealed that on March 15, 1969, 3 people had died in a car accident on Highway 30, just 2 miles from Miller's Diner. Harold Grimsby, 67, was driving home from his retirement party at the grain elevator. Martha Chen, 45, was returning from visiting her sister in Omaha. Fletcher Morrison, 17, was heading back to Millfield after a basketball game in the next county over. According to the accident report, Harold's car had crossed the center line during a blizzard, colliding head-on with Martha's vehicle. Fletcher's truck, following behind, couldn't stop in time and crashed into both cars. All 3 died instantly. The article included photos of the victims. I stared at the newspaper photos on my phone screen, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold it steady. Harold Grimsby wore the exact brown suit I saw every night. Martha Chen was pictured in the same floral dress. And Fletcher Morrison smiled from his senior portrait wearing the Letterman jacket that walked into my diner every night at 2:47 a.m. The timestamp on the accident report showed the collision occurred at 2:47 a.m. That night, I waited for them with growing terror. When they appeared in the parking lot at exactly 2:47, I watched through the window as they approached the door. In the fluorescent light of the diner, I could see details I'd missed before. Harold's suit had dark stains across the chest that looked suspiciously like blood. Martha's floral dress was torn and dirty, with what appeared to be glass embedded in the fabric. Fletcher's face bore deep cuts that hadn't been visible in the dim lighting of their usual booth. They took their seats, and I approached on unsteady legs, the coffee pot rattling against my palm. "The usual?" I managed to whisper. Harold looked up with those colorless eyes and spoke for the first time in 2 weeks. His voice was hollow, like wind through an empty building. "We're still trying to get home," he said. "Been trying for 56 years. Martha turned from the window, and I saw that half her face was caved in, her cheek hanging in shreds. "The road is so dark," she whispered. "We can't find our way." Fletcher's neck was bent at an impossible angle, his head tilted grotesquely to one side. "Mom's waiting for me," he said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater. I was supposed to be home by midnight. I backed away from the table, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. These weren't customers. They were the victims of that long-ago accident, trapped in some horrible loop, eternally trying to complete their final journey home. I ran to the back office and pulled up the security footage, scrolling through weeks of recordings from 2:47 a.m. Every single night showed the same thing. Empty booths, no customers, just me moving around the diner talking to invisible people, pouring coffee into empty cups, taking money from thin air. But the cash register receipts were real. The money was real. And every morning when I cleaned up, their booth was always left with the lingering scent of motor oil and burned rubber. I quit the next day, but not before learning from Harold Miller, the diner's owner, that I wasn't the first employee to leave because of the late-night regulars. In fact, no one had been able to work the overnight shift for more than a few months since the diner opened in 1971. "They're harmless," Harold assured me. "Just lost souls trying to find their way home. The least we can do is serve them coffee while they figure it out." I never went back to Miller's Diner, but sometimes, driving past it on Highway 30, I see three figures standing in the parking lot at 2:47 a.m., staring at the dark road ahead, still searching for a way home that they'll never find. Have you ever wondered what secrets your small town's government might be hiding beneath City Hall? The basement archives in Copper Ridge contain death certificates for people who were supposedly still alive, and missing person reports that were filed but never investigated. My name is Amir, and I moved to Copper Ridge, Montana 3 years ago, thinking I'd found the perfect government job in a peaceful mountain town. Population 1,200, nestled in a valley surrounded by abandoned copper mines that gave the town its name. The pay was decent for a records keeper. The cost of living was low. And after 15 years of bureaucratic chaos in Denver, the idea of managing a small town's simple filing system seemed like a dream. The basement of City Hall became my domain. Decades of documents, birth certificates, property deeds, tax records, all waiting to be digitized and organized. The previous records keeper, an elderly woman named Agnes Whitmore, had apparently kept everything but organized nothing. Boxes upon boxes of paperwork, dating back to the town's founding in 1898, were scattered throughout the underground storage rooms like a paper graveyard. My supervisor, Mayor Patricia Hendricks, seemed nervous when she gave me the tour. "Take your time down there," she said, wringing her hands. "Some of those old files might be confusing. If you find anything that doesn't make sense, just bring it to me directly. Don't discuss it with anyone else." I should have paid more attention to that warning. The first few weeks were routine. I organized property transfers, updated the digital database, and slowly brought order to Agnes's chaos. But then I started noticing inconsistencies that made my skin crawl. It began with the death certificates. Thomas Brennan, officially deceased in 1987 from a mining accident, was still receiving property tax bills. Sarah Liu, who supposedly died of natural causes in 1994, had a voter registration card filed just last year. Marcus Webb, declared dead from a car accident in 2001, had a marriage license application dated 2019. At first, I assumed these were clerical errors. Small towns often struggle with record keeping, and it wouldn't be unusual for some documentation to slip through the cracks. But as I dug deeper, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every death certificate I found had the same cause listed: industrial accident, copper mine exposure. Every single one. Heart attacks, car crashes, even what appeared to be a suicide. All officially recorded as mining-related deaths. The signatures on these certificates belonged to Dr. Marcus Chen, who, according to his medical license, had practiced in Copper Ridge from 1975 to 2020. I decided to cross-reference the death certificates with missing person reports, thinking I might find some correlation. What I discovered made my hands shake as I turned the pages. Missing person reports filled an entire filing cabinet, dating back decades. But they weren't filed chronologically or alphabetically. They were organized by what appeared to be some kind of code system. Each report had a red stamp across the top reading, "Resolved, no further action required." But none of them contained any notes about how they were resolved or where the missing persons were found. The reports painted a disturbing picture. drifters passing through town, homeless individuals seeking shelter, hitchhikers last seen on Highway 2 just outside Copper Ridge. All of them had disappeared without a trace, their cases officially closed within 48 hours of being filed. But the most chilling discovery was a handwritten ledger hidden behind the filing cabinet. It contained names, dates, and what appeared to be medical notations. The names matched the missing person reports exactly. The dates corresponded to their disappearances, and the medical notes described symptoms I'd never heard of. Cellular degradation accelerated, neural pathway dissolution, muscular tissue breakdown, day 7. I was staring at human experimentation records. The ledger entries went back 47 years, with detailed observations of what these people endured before they died. The handwriting was Dr. Chen's. I recognized it from the death certificates. Each entry ended the same way. Subject expired. Remains disposed of in mineshaft 7. Certificate filed under Industrial Accident Protocol. My mouth went dry as I realized what I was reading. The copper mines hadn't been abandoned because they were depleted. They'd been closed because the town had been using them as a dumping ground for human test subjects. I photographed everything with my phone, my hands trembling so badly I could barely focus the camera. Page after page of evidence that Copper Ridge had been systematically murdering vulnerable people for decades, using them as guinea pigs for some kind of medical research. The research appeared to focus on the effects of copper toxicity on human physiology, but not the kind that comes from environmental exposure. These people were being deliberately poisoned with concentrated copper compounds, their deaths monitored and recorded like lab rats. As I worked deeper into the night, I found correspondence between Dr. Chen and various pharmaceutical companies. Letters discussing human trials, acceptable casualty rates, and monetary compensation for research data. The town wasn't just covering up murders, they were profiting from them. A noise from upstairs made me freeze. Footsteps in the main hallway, slow and deliberate. I checked my phone. 11:47 p.m. City Hall should have been empty. I quickly shoved the documents back into their boxes and turned off the basement lights, my heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps grew louder, moving toward the basement door. I heard keys jingling, then the click of a lock turning. Mayor Hendricks descended the stairs with a flashlight, followed by 2 men I didn't recognize. They were dressed in medical scrubs, carrying what looked like a tackle box filled with syringes and vials. "I know you're down here, Emir," Mayor Hendricks called softly. "Agnes warned me this might happen when we hired someone new. People get curious about our old records." I crouched behind a stack of boxes, trying to control my breathing. Through a gap in the cardboard, I could see her flashlight beam sweeping the basement. "Dr. Chen's research was vital work," she continued. "Copper toxicity studies that help develop treatments for mining communities across the country. The people we used, they were transients, drifters, people nobody would miss. Their sacrifice served a greater purpose." One of the men spoke in a clinical tone. "The subject appears to be hiding. Should we begin the standard protocol?" "Give him a chance to cooperate first," Hendricks replied. "Emir, you have 2 choices. You can join our research program as a voluntary subject, or we can make the process more unpleasant. But either way, you can't leave Copper Ridge with what you've learned." I realized with horror that this was still happening. Dr. Chen might have retired, but the experiments were continuing with new medical staff. I was about to become the next entry in their ledger. Moving as quietly as possible, I made my way to the back exit of the basement, a door that led to the alley behind City Hall. It was locked from the inside, but I managed to turn the deadbolt without making noise. "We know you found the files, Amir," Hendricks called. "Every records keeper eventually does. That's why the position has such high turnover." I slipped out into the alley and ran toward my car, fumbling with my keys. Behind me, I heard shouting and the sound of feet pounding up the basement stairs. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I reached the FBI field office in Billings. The agent who took my statement seemed skeptical until I showed him the photographs on my phone. Within hours, they had a team heading to Copper Ridge. But when they arrived, City Hall's basement had been cleared out. Every box, every file, every piece of evidence had vanished. The building showed signs of a recent fire in the basement level, an electrical malfunction, according to Mayor Hendricks. Dr. Chen had died of natural causes 2 days before the FBI arrived. The 2 men in medical scrubs were nowhere to be found, and Mayor Hendricks claimed the basement had contained nothing but old tax records that were destroyed in the fire. The case was eventually closed due to lack of evidence, but the FBI agent who interviewed me gave me a warning that still keeps me awake at night. There are dozens of small towns like Copper Ridge scattered across rural America. Places where people disappear and nobody asks questions. Your photographs were the closest we've ever come to proving what we've suspected for years. I never returned to Copper Ridge, but I did some research on Agnes Whitmore, the previous records keeper. She'd lasted 6 months in the job before quitting suddenly and moving to Florida. I found her obituary from last year. She died of acute copper poisoning, a condition her doctors called highly unusual for someone with no known exposure to industrial copper sources. Sometimes I wonder how many other small-town employees have stumbled onto secrets they weren't supposed to find, and whether any of them lived long enough to tell anyone about it. What if the children in your classroom started sharing memories that weren't their own? 8-year-old McKenna Jonas began speaking in the voice of her great-grandmother, recounting lynchings from 1923 that were never documented in any history book. "My name is Viviana, and I thought substituting at Willowbrook Elementary would be a simple way to earn money while waiting for a permanent teaching position. The small Louisiana town sits deep in bayou country, where Spanish moss drapes ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds, and the air always carries the scent of stagnant water. Population 980, mostly Creole families whose roots stretch back generations, all connected by blood and shared secrets that outsiders like me weren't meant to understand. The principal, Mrs. Boudreau, hired me over the phone after their regular 3rd-grade teachers suffered what she called a nervous breakdown. I should have asked more questions about why someone would have a breakdown teaching 8-year-olds. But I needed the work, and small-town schools were always desperate for qualified substitutes. Willowbrook Elementary was a single-story brick building constructed in 1987, but it sat on land that had housed the town's original schoolhouse since 1889. Mrs. Boudreau gave me a hurried tour on my first morning, speaking in rapid French-accented English while checking her watch nervously. "The children are sensitive," she explained as we walked down hallways lined with cheerful artwork. "This is an old community with old ways. Sometimes they say things that might seem strange to outsiders. Just ignore anything that doesn't make sense and focus on the lesson plans." My classroom contained 18 students, all with the dark eyes and olive skin common to Creole heritage. They sat quietly at their desks, watching me with an intensity that seemed unusual for children their age. When I introduced myself and asked them to share their names, their responses were polite, but oddly formal. "My name is McKenna Jonas," said a girl with intricate braids. I live in the yellow house where my family has lived since before the Great Burning. I'm Briella Thibodeau, announced a boy with serious eyes. My papa says our bloodline remembers everything, even things that happened before we were born. The other children nodded solemnly at these introductions, as if such statements were perfectly normal. I attributed their behavior to small-town culture and began the day's math lesson. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the atmosphere in that classroom. The first incident occurred during silent reading time. I was grading papers at my desk when I heard McKenna Jonas speaking in a voice that definitely wasn't her own. The tone was deeper, more mature, with the cadence of someone much older. "They came at night with torches and ropes," she said, staring out the window toward the bayou. 17 souls swinging from cypress branches, while their families watched from the shadows, too terrified to scream. I looked up sharply. "McKenna, what are you reading?" She blinked and looked down at her book, a cheerful story about farm animals. "I'm sorry, Miss Viviana. Sometimes Grandmère Rose speaks through me. She wants people to remember what happened here." "Your grandmother?" I asked, confused. "Great-great-grandmother," McKenna corrected. "She died in 1924, but she never left. None of them left." The other children nodded in understanding, as if this explanation made perfect sense. I felt a chill run down my spine, but decided to redirect their attention back to reading. Over the following days, similar incidents became increasingly frequent and disturbing. During art class, Lana Habert drew detailed pictures of people hanging from trees while tears streamed down her face. When I asked about her artwork, she spoke in the voice of someone much older. "My name was Samuel Habert," she said without looking up from her drawing. "I was 26 when they accused me of looking at a white woman the wrong way. My wife was pregnant with our first child when they dragged me from our home." Paige Melanson began writing letters during English class, not to family members or friends, but to people who had been dead for decades. Her handwriting would change mid-sentence, becoming the elaborate script of someone from a different era entirely. "Dear Marie," one letter began in Paige's childish scrawl, then continued in elegant cursive. "The water in the well still tastes of blood after all these years. We cannot rest until the truth is known. Tell our children what really happened that November night. Tell them why the earth beneath this school will never stop weeping." I brought these incidents to Mrs. Boudreau's attention, but her reaction was more resignation than concern. "The children have always been connected to the past," she explained, avoiding eye contact. "It's the nature of this place. Their families have learned to accept it." "But they're speaking as if they're different people entirely," I insisted. "McKenna claims her great-great-grandmother is speaking through her. That's not normal behavior for an 8-year-old. Mrs. Boudreau's expression grew somber. "Ms. Viviana, there are things about Willowbrook that outsiders don't understand. This land has memory. The children are simply remembering." I decided to research the town's history, hoping to understand what the children were referencing. What I found in the local library's archives made my blood run cold. In November 1923, 17 black men from the Willowbrook community were lynched by a white mob from the neighboring town of Millerville. The official records claimed they were suspected of theft, but witness accounts suggested the real reason was their success in establishing independent businesses that competed with white-owned enterprises. The lynching took place on the exact spot where Willowbrook Elementary now stands. According to newspaper reports from the era, the victims were hanged from cypress trees that surrounded the original schoolhouse. Their bodies were left hanging for 3 days as a warning to other black families in the area. The crime was never prosecuted, and the white perpetrators faced no consequences. But the most disturbing detail was a quote from the sole survivor, a woman named Rose Jonas, who hid in the bayou with her young daughter during the massacre. "They think they've silenced us," Rose had told a reporter. "But the dead don't stay quiet in this place. Someday, the truth will speak through the voices of our children's children." Rose Jonas, McKenna's great-great-grandmother. I returned to school the next day with a new understanding of what I was witnessing. But that knowledge only made the experience more terrifying. The children weren't just speaking randomly. They were channeling the memories of the lynching victims, trying to tell their stories through the only voices available to them. During lunch, I gathered the courage to speak directly with McKenna about her great-great-grandmother. "Rose wants you to know something," McKenna said, her 8-year-old voice carrying the weight of decades. "The school was built here on purpose. The white families who owned the land knew what happened here. They thought building a school on top of graves would keep the spirits quiet. But children's minds are more open. We can hear them when adults cannot." "What do they want?" I whispered. "Justice," said Itzel Broussard, speaking in a voice that belonged to someone much older. "My name was Thomas Broussard. I was a teacher at the original schoolhouse. They killed me for teaching black children to read and write. We want the world to know our names, our stories, our truth." One by one, other children began speaking in the voices of the lynching victims. Garrett told me about his young wife and unborn child. Jaden described his dreams of opening a carpentry business. Fletcher spoke of the songs he used to sing in the church choir. Each story was heartbreaking, filled with details that no 8-year-old should know about lynching techniques, the smell of burning flesh, the sound of snapping ropes. But when I looked into these children's eyes, I saw not malice or madness, but profound sadness and a desperate need to be heard. The breaking point came during a parent-teacher conference when I tried to explain what was happening to the children's families. Instead of concern, I encountered a wall of knowing silence. "This has been happening for generations," explained McKenna's mother. "Our children carry the memories of those who came before. It's a burden and a blessing. They help the dead find peace by sharing their stories." "But it's affecting their education," I protested. "They can barely focus on lessons when they're channeling spirits of lynching victims." "Some lessons are more important than arithmetic," replied Itzel's father. "Our ancestors died to give us a voice. The least we can do is let them use it." I realized I was fighting against something much larger than childhood behavioral issues. This was a community's way of keeping their traumatic history alive, ensuring that the victims of the 1923 lynching wouldn't be forgotten. But watching 8-year-olds relive the terror and pain of racial violence was destroying my mental health. I lasted 2 more weeks before submitting my resignation, unable to bear another day of hearing children describe their own murders in heartbreaking detail. Mrs. Boudreau accepted my resignation without surprise. "You're the 14th substitute teacher we've lost in 5 years," she said sadly. "Not everyone can handle the weight of our history." As I packed my classroom supplies, McKenna approached my desk one final time. "Grandmère Rose wants to thank you for listening," she said in her own 8-year-old voice. "She says most adults try to make us stop talking about the old days. But remembering is important, even when it hurts." I never returned to Willowbrook, but I often think about those children carrying the memories of ancestors who died violently, ensuring their stories survive through generations. Sometimes I wonder if forgetting might be kinder than remembering. But then I recall Rose Jonas's words about the dead not staying quiet. In places like Willowbrook, The past refuses to remain buried, and the voices of the victims will continue speaking through their descendants until justice finally finds its way home. What would you sacrifice to keep your town's most important tradition alive? The Corn Festival Committee meeting ended with me being handed a congratulatory certificate and a shovel, while everyone smiled and told me how honored I should feel to be chosen for this year's special harvest. My name is Seth, and I moved to Harvest Moon, Iowa, thinking I'd found the perfect place to restart my life after losing my insurance adjuster job in Chicago. Population 2,400. Surrounded by endless cornfields that stretched to every horizon, where the biggest excitement was the annual Corn Festival that brought in thousands of tourists each October. The cost of living was dirt cheap, the people seemed friendly, and after 15 years of urban stress, the idea of small-town tranquility felt like salvation. I rented a modest house on Maple Street and quickly fell into the rhythm of rural life. Morning coffee at Dolly's Diner, grocery shopping at Henderson's Market, evening walks through neighborhoods where children played safely in front yards while their parents tended pristine gardens. Everyone knew everyone, and within a month, half the town was greeting me by name. The Corn Festival dominated every conversation as summer turned to fall. Harvest Moon had been hosting the celebration for 127 years, making it one of Iowa's oldest continuous agricultural festivals. The event drew visitors from 3 states, pumping vital tourism dollars into the local economy during what would otherwise be a quiet season. "You should volunteer for the festival committee," suggested Martha Chen, the librarian, when I mentioned wanting to get more involved in community activities. "They always need fresh blood, and it's a great way to meet people." I attended my first committee meeting in September, held in the basement of the Lutheran Church. 15 locals sat around folding tables covered with festival planning documents, their faces lit by harsh fluorescent lighting that cast strange shadows on the wood-paneled walls. "We're so pleased to have a newcomer joining us," announced Committee Chair Harold Grimsby, a retired farmer whose family had helped found the festival in 1897. "Fresh perspective is exactly what we need to keep our traditions alive." The meeting covered typical festival logistics: vendor permits, parking arrangements, security protocols, entertainment scheduling. But I noticed subtle undercurrents in their conversations that made me uncomfortable. Whispered references to the selection process, meaningful glances exchanged when discussing harvest requirements, and an odd emphasis on how this year's festival needed to be especially successful. "Seth," Harold said as the meeting wound down, "we'd like you to take on a special role this year. Something really important to the festival's success." The other committee members nodded enthusiastically, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. "What kind of role?" I asked. "The Harvest King," said Betty Whitmore, the mayor's wife. "It's a tremendous honor. The Harvest King represents the spirit of our community's agricultural heritage." They explained that the Harvest King would lead the festival's opening ceremony, ride on the main parade float, and participate in the traditional blessing of the harvest ritual that took place in the fields surrounding town. It sounded like typical small-town pageantry, and I was flattered to be chosen. "There's just one requirement," Harold added, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "The Harvest King must be committed to the role. Fully committed. It's not something you can back out of once you accept." Something in his phrasing bothered me. But the other committee members were looking at me with such hopeful expressions that I didn't want to disappoint them. "Of course," I said, "I'd be honored." The room erupted in applause, but I caught glimpses of relief on several faces, as if they'd been worried I might refuse. Over the following weeks, My training for the Harvest King role became increasingly strange. Betty Whitmore insisted I follow a specific diet: only locally grown corn, vegetables, and meat from animals raised within the county. Harold gave me a leather-bound book of traditional harvest songs, written in what appeared to be archaic German, mixed with symbols I didn't recognize. These songs have been passed down for generations, Harold explained. Every Harvest King learns them. It's part of the tradition. The songs were disturbing. They spoke of blood nourishing the earth, of sacrifice ensuring abundant harvests, of appeasing ancient spirits that demanded payment for their protection of the crops. When I questioned Harold about the violent imagery, he dismissed my concerns. "It's just old-world folklore," he said. "Agricultural communities have always understood that death feeds life. The corn dies so we can live. We honor that cycle." As the festival approached, I noticed other oddities around town. Hardware stores sold out of rope and shovels. The local church held nightly services that I wasn't invited to attend. Longtime residents avoided making eye contact when they saw me, while newcomers like myself received extra attention from shopkeepers and neighbors. 3 days before the festival, I discovered a room in the town library that wasn't on any floor plan. Hidden behind a false wall in the basement, it contained historical documents about previous Harvest Kings dating back to 1897. What I read made my hands shake so violently I could barely turn the pages. The documents weren't festival programs or ceremonial scripts. They were detailed accounts of ritual human sacrifice. Every year, the town selected an outsider to serve as Harvest King. The chosen individual would lead the festival celebration, then be taken to a field outside town where they would be killed and buried beneath the corn. Their blood was believed to ensure the following year's harvest would be abundant, protecting the community from crop failure and economic disaster. The records showed that it had worked. Harvest Moon had never experienced a failed harvest in 127 years. While neighboring communities struggled with drought, disease, and market fluctuations, Harvest Moon's corn consistently produced record yields. Each Harvest King had been carefully selected, always an outsider with no local family ties, usually someone experiencing life difficulties who wouldn't be quickly missed. The town would spend months building relationships with their chosen victim, making them feel welcome and valued before leading them to slaughter. I read account after account of men who had arrived in Harvest Moon seeking fresh starts, only to end up as fertilizer for the community's crops. Insurance salesmen, traveling merchants, drifters, unemployed workers, all of them eventually filling unmarked graves in farmers' field, while the town celebrated another successful harvest. The most recent entry was from last year. James Patterson, age 34, unemployed electrician from Minneapolis, relocated to Harvest Moon in June, selected as Harvest King August 15th, ritual completed October 12th, burial location, Section 7, Row 12. Corn yield increased 23% over previous year. I was this year's James Patterson. Racing home, I threw belongings into suitcases while planning my escape route. But when I opened my front door, Harold Grimsby was standing on my porch with 6 other committee members. "Going somewhere, Seth?" Harold asked pleasantly. "The festival starts tomorrow. The Harvest King can't miss his own celebration." "I know what you're planning," I said, my voice barely steady. "I found the records in the library." Harold's smile never wavered. "Of course you did. We left them there for you to find." Part of the tradition is that the Harvest King understands the importance of his sacrifice. It makes the ritual more meaningful. The other men moved closer, blocking any path of escape. "You can't just murder people," I protested. "This is insane." "We've been preserving this community for over a century," Betty Whitmore said, appearing behind the group. "One life feeds thousands. One death prevents famine. It's the most noble sacrifice a person can make." "No one will look for you," added Tom Henderson from the market. "You told everyone you were starting fresh, leaving your old life behind. Your disappearance will seem perfectly natural." They were right. I deliberately cut ties with my previous life when I moved to Harvest Moon. No family, few close friends, no job requiring my presence. I was the perfect victim. "The festival must go on," Harold said firmly, "with or without your cooperation. But it would be better for everyone if you played your role willingly." I spent that night locked in the church basement while the town prepared for the festival. Through the small window, I could see families setting up booths, hanging decorations, preparing for what they genuinely believed was a celebration worth killing for. The next morning, they dressed me in elaborate ceremonial robes and led me through the festival crowds. Thousands of tourists cheered as I rode the parade float, completely unaware they were applauding a man being led to execution. The festival was genuinely magical. Live music, incredible food, games and crafts that showcased the best of rural Iowa culture. Children laughed and played while their grandparents shared stories of previous celebrations. It was everything a small-town festival should be, except for the human sacrifice scheduled as the grand finale. As evening approached, Harold guided me toward Farmer's Field, where a crowd of locals had gathered around a freshly dug grave. "Any last words?" Harold asked, almost gently. I looked at the faces surrounding me. People who had welcomed me, fed me, included me in their community. They genuinely believed they were doing something necessary and sacred. "I hope it works," I said finally. "I hope your corn grows tall." The ritual was swift and surprisingly humane. They used a sedative before the final act, explaining that fear and pain would taint the sacrifice's effectiveness. As consciousness faded, I heard Harold speaking the ancient harvest songs, felt warm soil being shoveled over my body, and saw stars appearing in the darkening sky above Iowa's endless cornfields. The next year's harvest was the most abundant in Harvest Moon's history. What if your hobby revealed truths that were meant to stay hidden? The photographs I developed in my darkroom showed figures standing in windows of abandoned buildings, rituals being performed in empty fields, and faces of people who had been missing for years, none of which were visible when I actually took the pictures. My name is Elaine, and I moved to Pine Valley, Oregon, with nothing but a camera, some basic photography equipment, and dreams of documenting authentic small-town America. At 19, I thought I was embarking on an artistic journey that would launch my career as a photojournalist. Pine Valley seemed perfect for my project. Population 1,850, nestled in the Cascade Mountains, economically devastated by the closure of the lumber mills, but still clinging to a rustic charm that hadn't been commercialized by tourism. The town's main street looked like a movie set from the 1950s, complete with a classic diner, an old-fashioned barbershop, and storefronts with hand-painted signs advertising businesses that had been family-owned for generations. But beneath that Norman Rockwell exterior, I sensed something darker. Boarded-up shops, too many empty houses, and residents who watched strangers with suspicious eyes. I rented a small apartment above Murphy's hardware store and converted the bathroom into a makeshift darkroom. Digital photography was taking over the industry, but I preferred working with film. There was something magical about watching images slowly emerge in the developer solution, revealing details that weren't always apparent through the camera's viewfinder. My first few weeks in Pine Valley were spent photographing obvious subjects: the weathered facades of abandoned buildings, elderly residents sitting on front porches, children playing in the town park. Standard documentary photography that captured the melancholy beauty of economic decline. But when I developed those initial rolls of film, I noticed strange anomalies that made my skin crawl. In a photograph of the empty Cascade lumber mill, shadowy figures appeared to be standing in the upper floor windows, despite the building being locked and supposedly abandoned for 15 years. A picture of the town cemetery showed fresh flowers on graves that I distinctly remembered being bare when I took the shot. Most disturbing was a seemingly innocent photo of Main Street that revealed a group of people gathered in the town square performing what looked like a ritual, even though the square had been completely empty when I pressed the shutter. At first, I attributed these anomalies to double exposures or developing errors. Film photography was full of technical challenges that could create unexpected results. But as I continued documenting Pine Valley over the following weeks, the mysterious additions to my photographs became more frequent and increasingly disturbing. A picture of the old Presbyterian church showed candles burning in every window, casting an eerie glow that definitely hadn't been present during the day I photographed it. Images of the surrounding forest revealed clearings where groups of people appeared to be conducting ceremonies around large fires, despite my having hiked those exact areas and finding them completely undisturbed. The most unnerving discovery came when I was developing photographs of local residents. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the town's only remaining grocery store, appeared in her portrait with her eyes completely black, as if they'd been burned out from the inside. Sheriff Malloy, who had been friendly and helpful when I'd introduced myself, showed up in his photograph with what appeared to be blood covering his hands and uniform, though he'd been perfectly clean when I took his picture. I began keeping detailed notes about when and where each photograph was taken, comparing them with what actually appeared in the developed images. The pattern that emerged made me question my own sanity. Every photograph I took in Pine Valley revealed hidden activities that weren't visible to the naked eye. It was as if my camera was capturing events that existed on some parallel plane of reality, showing me what the town was really like beneath its seemingly innocent facade. Determined to understand what was happening, I started photographing specific locations at different times of day and night. The results were terrifying. Pictures of the town hall taken during normal business hours showed the basement windows glowing with an unnatural red light. Photographs of the local doctor's office revealed figures in medical scrubs carrying what appeared to be body bags to unmarked vans. Images of the elementary school captured children standing in perfect formations in the playground, their faces obscured by shadows that formed strange geometric patterns. But the most horrifying discovery came when I developed a roll of film from the Pine Valley Community Center, where I'd attended a seemingly innocent town meeting about tourism development. The photographs showed the same meeting I'd witnessed. Residents sitting in folding chairs, discussing ways to attract visitors to boost the local economy. But superimposed over this normal scene were images of the same people wearing hooded robes, surrounding what appeared to be an altar covered in symbols I didn't recognize. I realized my camera was somehow capturing the true nature of Pine Valley's residents, revealing activities that existed alongside their mundane daily routines but remained invisible to ordinary perception. Desperate for answers, I decided to confront someone about what I was seeing. I chose Sonny Carpenter, a local artist who seemed more open-minded than most residents and had been friendly during our previous interactions. When I showed Sonny the photographs, her reaction confirmed my worst fears. "You need to stop taking pictures," she said, her voice trembling as she stared at images of hooded figures performing rituals in locations around town. "They don't like being documented." "Who are they?" I demanded. Sunny glanced toward the windows of her art studio, as if checking to make sure we weren't being watched. "The families who've run this town for generations," she whispered. "Pine Valley didn't decline because the lumber industry collapsed. It declined because the people in power wanted it that way. Fewer outsiders, less scrutiny, more control over the population that remained." She explained that Pine Valley's economic problems were deliberately orchestrated by a group of influential families who had been practicing occult rituals for over a century. The empty buildings, the closed businesses, the exodus of younger residents. All of it was designed to create the perfect environment for their activities. They used the town as their personal domain. Sunny continued. The remaining residents are either part of their group or too afraid to leave. They've been conducting experiments, rituals, things that would be impossible in a more populated area. "What kind of experiments?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "People go missing," she said. "Travelers passing through, new residents who ask too many questions, anyone who threatens their control. The official story is always that they moved away or had accidents. But the truth is much worse." Sunny pulled out a folder containing newspaper clippings dating back decades. Headlines about mysterious disappearances, unexplained accidents, and sudden departures of people who had seemed happy and settled in Pine Valley. "Your camera is capturing their real activities," she explained. "Somehow, it's seeing through whatever supernatural influence they use to hide their true nature from ordinary perception." I stared at my photographs with new understanding. The hooded figures, the ritual gatherings, the blood-covered officials. These weren't supernatural anomalies or camera malfunctions. They were documentary evidence of an ongoing conspiracy that had been operating in Pine Valley for generations. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Hey, because they know about your photographs," Sunny said. "And they're planning to do something about it." As if summoned by her words, we heard vehicles pulling up outside the art studio. Through the window, I saw Sheriff Malloy and several other men I recognized from my photographs approaching the building. "Back exit," Sunny hissed, grabbing my arm. "Take your camera and negatives and get out of town. Don't stop driving until you reach Portland." I gathered my photography equipment while Sunny stalled the men at her front door, claiming she hadn't seen me all day. The back door led to an alley that connected to the main road out of Pine Valley. But as I reached my car, I realized they had anticipated this route. Harold Brennan, the mayor, was leaning against my vehicle with a pleasant smile that didn't hide the malice in his eyes. "Leaving so soon, Elaine?" he asked. "But you haven't finished your photographic project." "We were hoping you'd document our upcoming harvest celebration." Other townspeople began emerging from doorways and side streets, surrounding me with the same fake friendliness that had initially made Pine Valley seem welcoming. But now I could see past their deceptive appearances to the predators underneath. "Those are some interesting photographs you've been taking," Mayor Brennan continued. "Very artistic, very revealing. We'd love to discuss your work with you." I clutched my camera bag, knowing it contained evidence that could expose whatever Pine Valley's leaders were hiding. But I also knew that evidence would be worthless if I didn't survive to share it with the outside world. "The thing about small towns," Brennan said, his smile growing wider, "is that they're very good at keeping secrets. Especially secrets about people who disappear without a trace." The crowd began closing in, and I realized that my camera had captured more than just hidden activities. It had documented my own death warrant. By photographing their concealed rituals and ceremonies, I had become a threat that needed to be eliminated. As hands reached out to grab me, I managed one final photograph, a flash that captured the faces of Pine Valley's residents as they dropped their masks of humanity and revealed the monsters they truly were. That photograph, along with all my other evidence, was found 3 months later by a hiker who discovered my camera equipment scattered in the mountains outside Pine Valley. The images made their way to authorities, but the investigation was quietly closed after officials determined that the photographs showed obvious signs of manipulation and artistic enhancement. Pine Valley continues to exist, slowly decaying on the surface while hosting activities that would horrify anyone brave enough to see past their carefully constructed facade. Sometimes I wonder how many other small towns harbor similar secrets, protected by isolation and the natural human tendency to dismiss uncomfortable truths as impossible. My photographs prove that reality isn't always visible to the naked eye, and that some truths can only be captured by accident, revealed by technology that sees more than we intended it to see. How well do you really know what's coming out of your tap? The water quality reports I discovered in Clearwater Falls showed chemical compounds that don't exist in nature, designed specifically to alter human brain chemistry and suppress the formation of long-term memories. My name is Saul, and at 52, I thought I'd found the perfect semi-retirement job as a water quality inspector in Clearwater Falls, New Hampshire. After 30 years of dealing with environmental disasters and contamination crises in major cities, the idea of monitoring a pristine mountain town's water supply seemed like a peaceful way to wind down my career. Population 3,200, nestled in the White Mountains, famous for its crystal-clear springs and streams that had been featured in countless tourism brochures promoting nature's purest water. The job interview was conducted over the phone by town manager Patricia Wells, who explained that their previous water inspector had retired suddenly, and they needed someone with my experience to maintain their excellent safety record. The pay was surprisingly generous for such a small community, and the work seemed straightforward: routine testing, filing reports with state agencies, and ensuring that Clearwater Falls maintained its reputation for having some of the cleanest drinking water in New England. I rented a cabin on the outskirts of town and reported to the water treatment facility on my first Monday morning. The plant was modern and well-maintained, operated by Chief Engineer Marcus Chen, a soft-spoken man in his 40s who had been managing the facility for over a decade. The water practically treats itself, Marcus explained during my orientation tour. Our source is a natural underground spring system that's been feeding this valley for thousands of years. We mainly just monitor flow rates and chlorination levels. The facility seemed exactly as advertised: clean, efficient, and staffed by professionals who took pride in their work. The treatment process was minimal, consisting of basic filtration and standard disinfection protocols. Everything appeared completely normal. But during my first week of routine testing, I discovered anomalies that made absolutely no sense. The water samples contained trace amounts of compounds that shouldn't exist in any natural water source. Complex pharmaceutical molecules, synthetic neurotransmitter inhibitors, and chemical structures that I'd never encountered in 25 years of environmental science. The concentrations were incredibly low, barely detectable even with sophisticated testing equipment. But they were definitely present. When I brought these findings to Marcus Chen, his reaction was surprisingly dismissive. "Those readings are probably equipment contamination," he said without looking at my test results. "The state inspectors test our water quarterly and have never found anything unusual. Maybe the lab equipment needs recalibration." But I knew my equipment was functioning properly. I'd tested control samples from bottled water and nearby streams, and they showed no trace of these mysterious compounds. The contamination was specific to Clearwater Falls' municipal water supply. I decided to conduct more extensive testing, collecting samples from different points in the distribution system over several weeks. The results painted a disturbing picture. The unusual compounds were being introduced at the treatment plant itself, added to the water in carefully measured doses before it reached residents' homes. Even more troubling was the discovery that these chemicals weren't randomly distributed. The concentrations varied by neighborhood, with higher levels being delivered to areas where newer residents lived, while long-term community members received water with lower contamination levels. I researched the molecular structures I'd identified using databases of pharmaceutical compounds and experimental drugs. What I found made my hands shake as I read the technical specifications. The chemicals in Clearwater Falls' water supply were designed to affect human memory formation and cognitive function. Specifically, they inhibited the brain's ability to form lasting memories of traumatic or disturbing events, while enhancing susceptibility to suggestion and authority figures. In layman's terms, the town was drugging its population to make them compliant and forgetful. I spent the next several days observing residents more carefully, paying attention to their behavior patterns and social interactions. What I noticed was deeply unsettling. People in Clearwater Falls were unusually agreeable and passive. Conversations tended to be superficial, focusing on immediate concerns rather than long-term planning or complex problem-solving. Residents seemed genuinely happy, but in a vague, unfocused way that reminded me of patients on mild psychiatric medications. More disturbing was how they responded to questions about the town's history or unusual events. When I asked longtime residents about crimes, accidents, or controversies, they would pause with confused expressions, as if trying to remember something that remained just out of reach. "Funny thing," said Dolly Henderson, who ran the local diner and claimed to have lived in Clearwater Falls her entire life. "I can remember yesterday just fine, and I know I've been here for decades. But when I try to think about specific events from the past, everything seems kind of fuzzy." Other residents expressed similar experiences. They knew they had histories in the town, but couldn't recall details about significant events, conflicts, or changes that had occurred over the years. Their memories seemed limited to pleasant, routine activities, while anything potentially disturbing had been chemically erased. I realized I was witnessing the results of long-term pharmaceutical manipulation of an entire community's cognitive function. Determined to understand the scope of this operation, I broke into the water treatment facility after hours to examine records that weren't accessible during normal business hours. What I found in Marcus Chen's locked office was evidence of a decades-long experiment in population control. Files dating back to 1987 detailed the gradual introduction of memory-suppressing compounds into Clearwater Falls' water supply. The project was funded by a pharmaceutical company called Meridian Labs, which was conducting research on community-scale behavioral modification using unwitting human subjects. The town's leadership, mayor, police chief, school superintendent, and other key officials, were all aware of the experiment and received regular payments for their cooperation. They also received uncontaminated water delivered to their homes, protecting them from the cognitive effects that were being imposed on the general population. The research files contained detailed psychological profiles of residents, tracking how different chemical combinations affected memory formation, emotional stability, and social compliance. The scientists running the experiment had been refining their formulas for over 30 years, using the people of Clearwater Falls as laboratory rats. But the most horrifying discovery was a section labeled Incident Management. It contained reports of events that had been chemically erased from residents' memories. Industrial accidents that killed workers, mysterious disappearances of people who asked too many questions, and cover-ups of crimes committed by officials who knew their victims wouldn't remember the details. According to these records, my predecessor hadn't retired. He had discovered the contamination scheme and been murdered, his death staged to look like a hiking accident. His replacement, me, had been carefully selected based on psychological profiling that suggested I would be less likely to investigate unusual findings. They had miscalculated. As I photographed the incriminating documents with my phone, I heard vehicles pulling up outside the treatment facility. Through the window, I saw Sheriff Jameson and several other men approaching the building with flashlights and what appeared to be medical equipment. I quickly finished documenting the evidence and attempted to leave through a rear exit, but found Marcus Chen waiting for me with a syringe in his hand. "I'm sorry, Saul," he said, his voice carrying genuine regret. "You seem like a decent man, but you've discovered something that threatens the safety and stability of this entire community." "You're poisoning thousands of people?" I said, backing away from him. "We're protecting them," Marcus replied. "Do you know what this town was like before the water treatment program? Crime, depression, suicide, domestic violence, all the problems that plague communities when people dwell on traumatic memories and negative experiences. We've created a peaceful, happy society by helping residents focus on the present instead of being haunted by the past." Other men entered the building, surrounding me with the calm efficiency of people who had performed this routine many times before. "The chemical compounds are completely safe," continued Marcus. "No physical side effects, no permanent damage. People just live happier lives when they're not burdened by painful memories." "What about free will?" I demanded. "What about the right to make informed decisions about your own life?" "Free will is overrated," said Sheriff Jameson. "Most people are miserable when left to their own devices. We've eliminated that misery." They injected me with a sedative that made my limbs feel like lead. As consciousness faded, I heard them discussing how my accidental death would be staged and what story would be told to explain my disappearance. But they made one crucial mistake. Before entering the treatment facility, I had uploaded all the incriminating documents to a secure cloud storage account and sent copies to journalists, federal investigators, and environmental protection agencies. The evidence I'd gathered would survive, even if I didn't. I regained consciousness in a hospital bed in Boston, 3 days after being found unconscious on a hiking trail outside Clearwater Falls. The official story was that I'd suffered a medical emergency while exploring the mountains. But the doctors who treated me found traces of powerful pharmaceuticals in my bloodstream that were inconsistent with any known medical treatment. The evidence I'd uploaded sparked a federal investigation that eventually exposed the contamination scheme. Meridian Labs was shut down, its executives prosecuted for conducting illegal human experimentation. The town officials who had participated in the cover-up were arrested, and Clearwater Falls' water supply was thoroughly decontaminated. But the most disturbing aspect of the case was how the residents reacted to learning the truth about their situation. Many of them were angry, not at the officials who had been drugging them for decades, but at the investigators who had ended the program. "I was happy," one woman told reporters. "For the first time in my life, I wasn't anxious or depressed or worried about things I couldn't control. Now all those feelings are coming back, and I don't know how to handle them." Some residents actually petitioned to have the chemical treatment restored, arguing that ignorance had been preferable to the harsh realities of unfiltered memory and emotion. The case raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of happiness, the value of truth, and whether people have the right to live in chemically induced bliss if they choose to do so. I never returned to water quality inspection, but I still think about Clearwater Falls and wonder how many other communities might be conducting similar experiments, manipulating their populations in ways too subtle to detect. Sometimes the most dangerous contamination isn't the kind that makes you sick. It's the kind that makes you forget you were ever in danger at all. What if the vintage items you're buying came with more than just history? The antique music box I inherited from my grandmother's shop played a melody that summoned the spirit of a Victorian-era child who had been murdered by her own family. And she wasn't the only ghost attached to the items in my collection. My name is Elodie, and at 41, I thought inheriting Grandmother Rose's antique shop in Millbrook, Vermont would be a peaceful career change after years of corporate stress in Boston. The shop sat on Main Street in the heart of this picturesque tourist town, population 2,800, where fall foliage brought thousands of visitors seeking authentic New England charm and genuine antiques with interesting provenance. Rose had run Timeless Treasures for over 50 years, building a reputation among collectors for finding unique pieces with fascinating histories. The shop was crammed with Victorian furniture, vintage jewelry, antique dolls, old photographs, and curiosities from estate sales across New England. Everything had been meticulously cataloged with handwritten tags describing the item's age, origin, and previous owners. But what I discovered during my first week of inventory made me realize that Grandmother Rose had been running more than just an antique business. Hidden in her office safe was a leather-bound journal containing detailed records of every item in the shop, but not the kind of information you'd expect from a typical antique dealer. Instead of purchase prices and profit margins, Rose had documented supernatural activity associated with each piece. The Victorian music box that played Fur Elise was noted as haunted by Emma Whitmore, age 8, murdered 1887. Manifests between 2 to 4 a.m., seeks justice for family cover-up. A Civil War-era photograph of a Union soldier was labeled, contains spirit of James Morrison, died Gettysburg, 1863. Appears in reflective surfaces, warns of impending danger. An ornate silver mirror from the 1920s carried the notation, Portal for Margaret Chen, suicide victim. Extremely dangerous. Do not allow prolonged viewing. Every single item in the shop was haunted. According to Rose's journal, she hadn't been selling antiques to unsuspecting tourists. She had been deliberately collecting cursed objects and haunted artifacts, then carefully placing them with specific buyers who she believed could help the attached spirits find peace or resolution. The journal contained profiles of customers, detailing their spiritual sensitivity, personal traumas, and psychological makeup. Rose had been matching tormented souls with people she thought could provide the help these spirits needed, using her antique business as cover for what appeared to be a supernatural counseling service. But some entries in the journal were far more disturbing. Certain items were marked as containment, do not sell, with warnings about malevolent entities that posed genuine danger to anyone who came in contact with them. These pieces were stored in a basement room I hadn't discovered during my initial exploration of the building. Curiosity overcoming caution, I found the basement entrance hidden behind a bookshelf in Rose's office. The narrow stairs descended into a climate-controlled chamber that felt like stepping into a morgue. The temperature was at least 20 degrees colder than the rest of the building, and the air had a quality that made every breath feel labored and unpleasant. The basement contained approximately 30 items arranged on metal shelving with precise spacing between each piece. Unlike the cheerful clutter of the main shop, these objects were isolated and marked with symbols I didn't recognize. Each had a detailed warning card describing the supernatural threat it contained. A porcelain doll from the 1890s was labeled Vessel for Lilith Brennan, age 6. Died of deliberate poisoning by governess. Violent manifestations, attempts to harm children, never removed from Salt Circle. The doll sat in the center of a perfectly drawn circle made from what appeared to be sea salt. its glassy eyes staring with an intensity that made my skin crawl. An antique wedding dress from the 1920s hung on a mannequin with a card reading, "Worn by Sarah Morrison at forced marriage ceremony. Murdered on wedding night by abusive husband. Seeks to prevent other weddings. Has caused 3 divorces and 2 deaths. Extreme caution." The dress moved slightly in the still air, as if being worn by an invisible bride. But the most terrifying item was a simple wooden rocking chair, with a warning that made my hands tremble. Property of the Harvest Moon cult. Used in ritual sacrifices, 1897-1923. Contains multiple violent spirits of murder victims. Chair rocks on its own. Whispers names of future victims. Under no circumstances should anyone sit in this chair. I realized that Rose had been running a supernatural containment facility disguised as an antique shop, protecting the community from dangerous haunted objects, while helping benevolent spirits find resolution through carefully selected customers. But now, she was gone, and I had no idea how to continue her work. Over the following days, I experienced increasingly disturbing supernatural activity throughout the building. The music box played its haunting melody at random times, always followed by the sound of a child crying somewhere in the walls. Mirrors reflected figures that weren't physically present in the room. Items moved on their own, rearranging themselves in patterns that seemed to carry messages I couldn't decipher. The journal revealed that Rose had been part of a generational tradition. Her grandmother had started the practice in the 1920s, collecting cursed objects and haunted artifacts to prevent them from causing harm in the broader community. Each generation of women in our family had inherited both the business and the responsibility of managing these supernatural threats. But Rose's final entry in the journal was dated just 3 days before her death. Elodie shows no signs of the sight. She cannot see or hear the spirits that speak to me daily. I fear what will happen to the containment protocols when I am gone. The malevolent entities in the basement are growing stronger, feeding off each other's energy. Without proper management, they could break free and terrorize Millbrook. I was the first person in 4 generations who lacked the psychic sensitivity necessary to safely manage the haunted collection. As if responding to Rose's fears, the supernatural activity intensified dramatically over my second week in the shop. The basement door, which I had locked with 3 deadbolts, was found standing wide open each morning. Items from the containment area began appearing in the main shop, their salt circles broken and their protective barriers disrupted. The porcelain doll appeared on the main sales floor one morning, sitting in a child-sized rocking chair with fresh tears streaming down its painted cheeks. When I tried to return it to the basement, it became so heavy I couldn't lift it, and its eyes began following my movement around the room. The antique wedding dress manifested upstairs wearing itself, walking through the shop like an invisible bride preparing for a ceremony that would never come. Customers fled in terror when the dress approached them, though most couldn't explain exactly what had frightened them so badly. But the most dangerous development was that the cult rocking chair had somehow moved itself to the front window display, where it rocked gently back and forth while tourists photographed it from the sidewalk. I could hear it whispering names in a voice too soft to understand, but definitely malevolent in intent. I called the local priest, hoping religious intervention might help contain the supernatural chaos. But Father Mackenzie took one look at the basement collection and refused to enter the building again. "Your grandmother was dealing with forces beyond my understanding," he explained from the safety of the sidewalk. "These aren't simple hauntings that can be blessed away. These are tormented souls bound to objects through trauma, violence, and occult practices. Only someone with your grandmother's specific abilities could manage them safely." Desperate for help, I contacted paranormal investigators, occult specialists, and anyone else who might understand what I was dealing with. Most of them refused to visit the shop after I described the basement collection. Those who did come took one look at the items and immediately left, warning me that the concentration of supernatural energy was unlike anything they'd ever encountered. "It's like a supernatural prison," explained Dr. Sandra Mitchell, a parapsychologist from the University of Vermont. "Your grandmother had somehow created a containment system that kept these entities from harming others while giving them a form of existence that satisfied their need to remain connected to the physical world. But without her psychic abilities to maintain that balance, the system is collapsing. The breaking point came during my third week when I woke up to find every item from the basement collection had moved into the main shop overnight. The protective salt circles were broken, the warning cards were scattered across the floor, and the haunted objects were arranging themselves into a pattern that looked suspiciously like a summoning circle. The rocking chair sat in the center of this arrangement, rocking violently while whispering what I now realized were the names of everyone who had died in Millbrook over the past century. The porcelain doll sat on its lap, head rotating slowly to track my movement. The wedding dress hung from the ceiling like a lynching victim, swaying with malevolent purpose. I knew I was in immediate danger, but I also understood that these entities wouldn't remain confined to the antique shop much longer. If they escaped into Millbrook, they would terrorize the entire community with the same violence and trauma that had originally bound them to their physical objects. In Rose's journal, I found one final entry I had missed during my initial reading. Emergency protocol. If containment fails and Elodie cannot maintain the barriers, the entire building must be destroyed by fire. The flames will release the spirits to whatever comes next, but it will prevent them from harming the living. The insurance policy contains a clause covering supernatural incidents. Burn it all. That night, I followed my grandmother's final instructions. The antique shop burned completely to the ground, taking with it decades of supernatural containment and 4 generations of family responsibility. As the flames consumed Rose's lifework, I heard voices in the smoke. Dozens of them, some angry, some grateful, all finally free from their earthly prisons. The fire department ruled it an electrical malfunction, and I never told anyone the truth about what had really happened in that basement. Sometimes, I wonder if I made the right choice, or if there were other options I should have explored. But walking through Millbrook now, seeing families with children playing safely in the town square, I know that some responsibilities are too dangerous to inherit, and some family traditions are too deadly to continue. The spirits are at peace now, one way or another, and that's what Rose would have wanted most. What would you do if your job required you to ignore the screams you heard every night? The security manual at Shadowbrook General Hospital included a specific protocol for Level B3 disturbances that instructed guards to wear noise-canceling headphones between midnight and 4 a.m., with a bonus payment for discretionary silence. My name is Jamari, and at 30 years old, I thought taking a night security job at Shadowbrook General Hospital would be temporary work while I figured out my next move after the textile factory closed. The hospital served Shadowbrook, Kentucky, population 1,400. A former coal mining town where black lung disease and industrial accidents had created a thriving medical facility that seemed too large and modern for such a small community. The pay was surprisingly generous for a security position, nearly twice what I'd made at the factory. And the benefits package included health insurance that covered my entire family. Hospital Administrator Dr. Patricia Wells explained during my interview that they valued security staff who could maintain confidentiality and handle the unique challenges of working in a medical environment. "Hospitals can be disturbing places at night," she said. studying my resume with unusual intensity. Patients sometimes experience episodes that can be unsettling to witness. We need security personnel who can focus on their duties without becoming distracted by medical situations they don't understand. She handed me a thick security manual with sections highlighted in yellow. Pay special attention to the protocols for different levels of incidents. Following these procedures exactly is essential for maintaining your employment and ensuring patient privacy. My first shift began at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in March. The hospital was eerily quiet compared to the busy medical facility I'd visited during daytime hours. Most patients were asleep. The halls were dimly lit, and only essential staff remained on duty. I was assigned to patrol the main floors while avoiding the basement level, which was restricted to authorized medical personnel only. The security manual contained protocols for various situations: medical emergencies, visitor violations, equipment malfunctions, and something called Level B3 disturbances that was described in frustratingly vague terms. According to the manual, B3 incidents were specialized medical situations requiring enhanced privacy protection, and the appropriate response was to implement audio isolation protocols and maintain standard patrol routes without deviation. Audio isolation protocols meant putting on noise-canceling headphones that were provided in the security office and continuing my rounds while ignoring any sounds that might indicate medical procedures in progress. Around 1 a.m. during my first shift, I understood why this protocol existed. Screams began echoing from somewhere below the main floor. Not the typical sounds of patients in pain, but sustained, desperate shrieking that suggested someone was experiencing unimaginable agony. The screams were accompanied by other sounds: mechanical humming, metal clanking against metal, and what sounded like multiple voices speaking in clinical, professional tones. Following protocol, I put on the noise-canceling headphones and continued my patrol of the authorized areas. But even with the audio equipment, I could feel the vibrations of whatever was happening in the basement traveling through the building's structure. Over the following weeks, I learned to expect the B3 disturbances between midnight and 4 a.m. They occurred 3 to 4 nights per week, always following the same pattern: mechanical preparation sounds around midnight, followed by screaming that would last anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours. Then silence until my shift ended at 7 a.m. The hospital's day shift staff seemed completely unaware of the nighttime activities. When I mentioned the disturbances to a friendly nurse, she looked genuinely confused. "Basement level?" she said. "There is no basement level. The hospital was built on a concrete slab because of the unstable soil from old mining tunnels. You must be hearing sounds from the mechanical rooms on the main floor." But I had studied the hospital's floor plan during my orientation, and there was definitely a basement level marked on the architectural drawings. The stairwell leading down from the main floor was clearly labeled B1, authorized personnel only, and required keycard access that my security credentials didn't include. Curious about what was actually happening during these disturbances, I began documenting the patterns in a notebook. The screaming always involved multiple voices, sometimes male, sometimes female, occasionally what sounded like children. The mechanical sounds suggested sophisticated medical equipment, but nothing I recognized from my limited experience with hospitals. Most disturbing was the realization that the screaming always stopped abruptly, as if the person making the sounds had suddenly lost consciousness, or worse. During my third week, I encountered Dr. Marcus Chen leaving the restricted stairwell at 3:47 a.m. He was wearing scrubs covered in what appeared to be fresh blood, carrying a medical bag that looked like it belonged in a surgical suite rather than a security patrol. "Working late tonight, Jamari," he said pleasantly, as if there was nothing unusual about his appearance or location. Everything okay down there, Doc? I asked, trying to sound casual. Just routine procedures, he replied. Nothing that concerns security. I hope you're following the audio protocols. Some medical situations can be disturbing to untrained personnel. Dr. Chen's tone was friendly, but carried an undertone that made it clear I shouldn't ask additional questions. The next night, I noticed a pattern I'd missed before. During B3 disturbances, certain parking spaces near the hospital's rear entrance were occupied by vehicles that weren't there during normal business hours. The license plates were from different states: Ohio, Tennessee, West Virginia, and the cars looked like they belonged to people traveling long distances rather than local residents. I began taking photographs of these vehicles, documenting their arrival and departure times. The pattern was consistent. Cars would arrive between 10 p.m. and midnight, park in specific designated spots, then leave between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. The same vehicles never returned, suggesting that whatever brought these people to Shadowbrook was a one-time occurrence. But the most chilling discovery came when I recognized one of the cars. A red Toyota Camry with Ohio plates had been parked near the rear entrance during a particularly intense B3 incident that lasted nearly 4 hours. 3 days later, I saw the same car featured in a missing person report on the local news. Sarah Morrison, a 34-year-old nurse from Columbus, had disappeared while driving to visit her sister in Tennessee. Her car was found abandoned on a back road outside Shadowbrook with no signs of foul play. The news report showed security footage of Sarah stopping for gas just 20 miles from the hospital. But there was no explanation for how her car had ended up in our parking lot during a night when protocol required me to ignore whatever was happening in the basement. I started researching missing person cases from surrounding areas, focusing on people who had disappeared along routes that passed through or near Shadowbrook. What I found made my hands shake as I scrolled through case after case of unexplained vanishings. Over the past 5 years, 37 people had gone missing within a 50-mile radius of Shadowbrook General Hospital. All of them had been traveling alone. All had disappeared without leaving clear evidence of their final destinations, and all had been reported missing by family members who described them as responsible people who wouldn't simply vanish without explanation. The demographics were telling. Healthy adults between ages 25 and 45, with no history of mental illness or substance abuse, representing a cross-section of professions and backgrounds that suggested random selection rather than targeted victims. I realized that Shadowbrook General Hospital wasn't treating patients from the local community. It was processing people who had been kidnapped or lured to the facility for purposes that required soundproof basement levels and security guards who were paid extra to ignore screaming. The breaking point came during my 4th week when I witnessed the arrival process firsthand. I was conducting my routine exterior patrol around 11:30 p.m. when I saw an unmarked van pull up to the rear entrance. 2 men in hospital scrubs unloaded what appeared to be an unconscious person on a gurney, wheeling them quickly through doors that I had never seen open during normal hospital operations. The person on the gurney was clearly alive but sedated, moving slightly as they were transported into the building. Within 30 minutes, the screaming began, and this time, I recognized the voice as belonging to the same person I had just seen delivered to the hospital like cargo. I knew I was witnessing human trafficking, illegal medical experimentation, or something equally horrific that was being conducted under the cover of a legitimate medical facility. But I also knew that my job, my family's health insurance, and possibly my life depended on following the security protocols that required me to ignore what I was seeing. The next morning, I submitted my resignation to Dr. Wells, citing personal reasons that prevented me from continuing in the position. "That's unfortunate," she said, studying my resignation letter with the same intensity she had shown during my interview. I hope you understand that your employment contract includes confidentiality agreements that remain in effect indefinitely. Violating those agreements would have serious legal and personal consequences. Her tone was pleasant, but the threat was unmistakable. I left Shadowbrook that day and never returned. But I've never forgotten the sounds that came from that basement or the faces of the people who disappeared after being delivered to the hospital in unmarked vehicles. Sometimes I wonder how many other small-town medical facilities operate similar programs, protected by isolated locations and security staff who are paid well enough to ignore the screaming. The hardest part is knowing that those people are still down there, somewhere beneath Shadowbrook General Hospital, experiencing whatever procedures require soundproof rooms and security guards with noise-canceling headphones. And I did nothing to stop it because I needed the job more than I needed to save strangers who were already beyond help. What if every house you showed had the same dark secret? The property records I discovered revealed that Peaceful Meadows Retirement Community was built directly on top of a mass grave containing over 400 victims of a government-covered epidemic from 1952. And every single home was experiencing the same supernatural phenomena. My name is Layla, and at 38, I thought specializing in retirement community properties would be a stable niche in North Carolina's booming real estate market. Peaceful Meadows seemed like the perfect development to focus on. A planned community of 200 homes designed specifically for active seniors, complete with a golf course, community center, and medical facilities. The houses were beautiful, reasonably priced, and located in the scenic foothills just outside Asheville. What I couldn't understand was why the turnover rate was so incredibly high. In the 18 months since Peaceful Meadows had opened, over 60 homes had been listed and relisted multiple times. Residents would move in with great enthusiasm, then put their houses back on the market within 3 to 6 months, usually at significant financial losses. Most of them claimed they were relocating to be closer to family, but their hasty departures and willingness to sell below market value suggested something more troubling was driving them away. My first listing in Peaceful Meadows was a charming 3-bedroom ranch at 47 Sunset Drive, owned by Harold and Martha Brennan, a retired couple from Charlotte who had moved to the community just 4 months earlier. "We love the house," Martha explained during our initial meeting, her hands trembling as she poured coffee. "The neighborhood is beautiful, the amenities are wonderful, and our neighbors are lovely people. But we just can't stay here anymore." "Is there a specific problem with the property?" I asked, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way both she and Harold kept glancing toward the hallway leading to their bedrooms. "It's the cold spots," Harold said quietly. "Every house in this development has them. Areas where the temperature drops 20 or 30 degrees for no reason. They move around, but they're always there." Martha nodded vigorously. "And the sounds. Coughing fits that seem to come from inside the walls. People calling for help when there's nobody there. Our neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, says it sounds like a hospital ward at night." I attributed their concerns to the overactive imaginations of elderly residents adjusting to a new living environment. But as I began showing their house to potential buyers, I experienced the phenomena they had described. The cold spots were real and unmistakable. Certain areas of every room would suddenly become frigid, as if Arctic air was being pumped through invisible vents. The temperature changes were so dramatic that my breath became visible in these zones, even though the rest of the house maintained a comfortable 72 degrees. More disturbing were the sounds. During quiet moments between showing appointments, I heard what sounded like dozens of people coughing, wheezing, and struggling to breathe. The sounds seemed to come from beneath the floors, as if there was a hidden basement level filled with people suffering from respiratory illnesses. Over the following weeks, I listed 6 more properties in Peaceful Meadows, and every single home exhibited identical supernatural phenomena. Cold spots that moved throughout the houses like invisible presence walking through rooms. Sounds of sick people calling for help, begging for water, or crying in pain. And in every master bedroom, the overwhelming scent of disinfectant and death that reminded visitors of hospitals or funeral homes. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, and I began researching the history of the land where Peaceful Meadows had been built. According to county records, the development sat on property that had previously been owned by the federal government from 1950 to 1987. The land had been used for what was vaguely described as public health research facilities. But the specific nature of these facilities was classified in documents that remained sealed despite multiple Freedom of Information Act requests. Local newspaper archives from the early 1950s contained scattered references to a medical emergency that had affected several counties in western North Carolina, but the details were frustratingly vague. Articles mentioned quarantine protocols, specialized treatment facilities, and federal health intervention. But the actual nature of the medical crisis was never clearly explained. I decided to interview longtime residents of the area who might remember events from that era. What I learned from elderly locals made my blood run cold. They told us it was polio, explained Mrs. Dorothy Chen, age 89, whose family had lived in the area for generations. Summer of 1952, suddenly all these children and young adults started getting sick with something that looked like polio but wasn't quite the same. High fevers, breathing problems, paralysis that came on much faster than normal polio cases. According to Mrs. Chen, the federal government had quickly established a quarantine facility on the land that now housed Peaceful Meadows. Hundreds of patients from across the region were transported to this facility for specialized treatment that wasn't available at regular hospitals. They built it fast, she continued. Maybe 6 weeks from breaking ground to opening the doors. Huge complex with multiple buildings, all surrounded by high fences with guards. They said it was for the patient's protection, but it looked more like a prison. The most disturbing detail was that none of the patients who entered the facility ever came back out. Families weren't allowed to visit, Mrs. Chen explained. They said the disease was too contagious, that even trained medical personnel could only enter wearing special protective equipment. Parents would get letters saying their children were improving, but they never saw them again. Another elderly resident, Mr. Thomas Whitmore, had worked construction on the original facility as a young man. His account provided chilling details about what they had actually built. Underground levels, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Most of the facility was below ground, with ventilation systems that pumped air up from deep underground chambers. They said it was to prevent the disease from spreading. But those underground areas looked more like mass housing than hospital wards. According to Whitmore, the construction crew had been required to sign confidentiality agreements and were supervised by federal agents throughout the building process. The facility included multiple underground levels connected by tunnels with industrial-grade ventilation, drainage systems that could handle large volumes of liquid waste, and what appeared to be cremation equipment. We thought we were building a hospital, he said. But looking back, I think we were building a disposal facility. By late 1952, the quarantine facility had reportedly housed over 400 patients. Then, suddenly, all activity at the facility ceased. The federal government claimed that the epidemic had been successfully contained and all patients had recovered. But no one in the local community ever saw any of these supposed survivors. The facility operated in complete secrecy until 1987, when the federal government sold the land to private developers after demolishing all surface structures and filling in the underground levels with concrete. I realized that Peaceful Meadows had been built directly on top of a mass grave containing hundreds of victims of what appeared to be illegal medical experimentation disguised as epidemic treatment. The cold spots, the sounds of sick people, the hospital odors, they were manifestations of the spirits of people who had died in agony in underground chambers, calling for help that never came, begging for water that was never provided, crying for families they would never see again. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to Peaceful Meadows with new understanding of what residents were experiencing. The supernatural phenomena weren't random hauntings. They were the collective memories of mass death imprinted on the land itself. I interviewed more residents who were preparing to leave the community, and their stories painted a consistent picture of supernatural activity that went far beyond simple cold spots and mysterious sounds. "I see them sometimes," whispered Mrs. Sarah Morrison, who was selling her home after only 2 months. "Especially at night. People in hospital gowns walking through the walls, looking for something they can't find. Children calling for their mothers. Adults begging someone to make the pain stop." Another resident, Mr. Fletcher Johnson, described waking up to find his bedroom filled with the sounds of dozens of people struggling to breathe, as if his house had been transformed into a tuberculosis ward. "It's not malicious," he explained. "They're not trying to hurt us. They're just still there, still suffering, still hoping someone will help them." The most heartbreaking account came from Mrs. Brower's Betty Henderson, whose house sat near the center of the development where the facility's main underground complex had been located. "They speak to me sometimes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Children mostly. They want me to tell their families what happened to them. They want someone to know that they didn't just disappear, that they died scared and alone in those tunnels while their parents thought they were getting better. I faced an ethical dilemma that kept me awake for weeks. I had documentary evidence that Peaceful Meadows was built on a mass grave, that the residents were being terrorized by the spirits of government test subjects, and that the developer had almost certainly known about the land's history when they chose to build there. But I also knew that revealing this information would destroy the property values of 200 families who had invested their life savings in what they thought were dream retirement homes. I chose to quietly withdraw from representing properties in Peaceful Meadows, citing scheduling conflicts rather than the truth about supernatural activity. But I did provide the historical research I'd gathered to a journalist who specialized in investigating government cover-ups. The story that eventually emerged revealed that the 1952 polio epidemic in western North Carolina had actually been a cover for biological weapons testing conducted on unwilling subjects, including children, mentally disabled individuals, and poor families who were told they were receiving free medical treatment. The victims had been deliberately infected with experimental pathogens, then monitored as they died in underground chambers, while researchers documented the progression of diseases that had been engineered to be more deadly than anything found in nature. Peaceful Meadows was eventually abandoned by its residents and demolished by the developer, who faced multiple lawsuits but avoided criminal charges due to statutes of limitations and classified government documents that couldn't be used as evidence. The land remains empty today, too contaminated by both supernatural activity and public knowledge to ever be developed again. Sometimes I drive past that empty lot and wonder if the spirits found peace when their story was finally told, or if they're still there, waiting in those underground chambers for someone to acknowledge their suffering and give them the dignity in death that was denied to them in life. What if documenting your town's history meant uncovering its most deadly secrets? The genealogy records I discovered in Heritage Point's archives revealed that every founding family had maintained their power for 150 years through a pattern of ritualistic murders disguised as accidents. And I had just become their next target. My name is Lionel, and at 67, I thought creating a comprehensive historical archive for Heritage Point, Texas, would be a peaceful retirement project. After 40 years of teaching high school history, I wanted to preserve the stories of this small frontier town, population 2100, where my wife and I had decided to spend our golden years. The town council had enthusiastically supported my volunteer efforts, providing access to city records, church documents, and family papers that had never been properly cataloged or studied. Heritage Point had been founded in 1874 by 5 families who had traveled west together in a wagon train. The Brennans, Chens, Morrisons, Whitmores, and Hendersons. These founding families had established successful cattle ranches, built the town's first businesses, and maintained political and economic control of the community for 6 generations. Their descendants still owned the largest properties, held the most important civic positions, and were treated with a reverence that bordered on worship by longtime residents. The town council had given me a small office in the basement of the courthouse, where I could organize historical materials and conduct interviews with elderly residents. Mayor Patricia Brennan, great-great-granddaughter of founding patriarch Harold Brennan, personally delivered boxes of family documents that had been stored in various attics and basements for decades. "We're so grateful for your work, Lionel," she said warmly. Heritage Point's history deserves to be properly preserved and celebrated. These families built something remarkable out here in the wilderness. For the first few months, my research painted exactly the picture Mayor Brennan had described. The founding families had overcome incredible hardships to establish a thriving community in harsh frontier conditions. They had survived droughts, Indian raids, cattle rustlers, and economic downturns that had destroyed other settlements. Their success story was genuinely inspiring. But as I dug deeper into genealogical records, property transfers, and death certificates, I began noticing patterns that made me increasingly uncomfortable. The founding families had maintained their wealth and power through an unusually high number of convenient deaths among potential rivals, business competitors, and community members who might have challenged their authority. These deaths were always officially attributed to accidents, illnesses, or violence committed by outsiders. But the timing and circumstances were suspiciously beneficial to the founding family's interests. In 1881, Thomas Murphy, a merchant who had opened a store that competed with Henderson's General Store, died in what was described as a hunting accident. His business was immediately purchased by the Henderson family at a fraction of its value. In 1889, Sarah Collins, a school teacher who had been organizing parents to demand better educational funding, supposedly died of food poisoning after attending a community dinner hosted by the Brennan family. The pattern continued decade after decade. Anyone who posed economic, political, or social challenges to the founding families seemed to meet untimely ends. Under circumstances that were always officially ruled accidental, but statistically impossible to explain as coincidence. But the most disturbing discovery came when I cross-referenced these suspicious deaths with lunar calendars from the same time periods. Every single death had occurred within 3 days of a new moon. This correlation was so consistent across 150 years of records that it couldn't possibly be coincidental. The founding families were timing their eliminations of threats to coincide with the darkest nights of each month, suggesting a level of premeditation and ritual planning that went far beyond opportunistic murder. I decided to research occult practices and ritual murder to understand what significance the new moon might have in criminal activities. What I learned made my hands shake as I read through historical accounts of frontier-era cult behavior. New moon periods had been traditionally associated with dark magic rituals that supposedly drew power from the absence of lunar light. In certain occult belief systems, murders committed during new moons were thought to transfer the victim's life force to the perpetrators, ensuring prosperity, health, and continued dominance over their communities. The founding families of Heritage Point appeared to have been practicing ritual human sacrifice disguised as accidents for 6 generations, using occult beliefs to justify murdering anyone who threatened their control of the town. But modern genealogy records showed that this practice was continuing into the present day. In 1987, Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician who had been advocating for a new hospital that would compete with the Chen family's medical clinic, died in a car accident during a new moon. In 1995, Janet Thompson, a lawyer who had been investigating irregular property sales involving the Morrison Ranch, supposedly committed suicide by drowning during a new moon period. In 2003, Robert Johnson, an accountant who had discovered financial irregularities in the town's budget, died in a house fire that occurred 3 days after a new moon. Each of these deaths had eliminated someone who posed a threat to the founding family's interests, and each had occurred during the lunar period traditionally associated with ritual sacrifice. I realized I was documenting evidence of an ongoing conspiracy that had been operating for 150 years, protected by isolation, family loyalty, and the natural human tendency to accept official explanations for tragic events. But the most terrifying discovery was in the records of my own research project. I found a town council meeting transcript from 3 months ago, just 2 weeks after I had begun my historical work. The discussion, which had been marked Executive Session Confidential, contained references to the outsider historian and traditional protocols for protecting family interests. Mayor Brennan had specifically stated, "Mr. Rodriguez's research is becoming more thorough than anticipated. If he continues investigating genealogical patterns, he may discover information that could damage Heritage Point's reputation and our family's standing in the community." The meeting minutes included a motion to implement traditional solutions if the historian's work threatens community stability, which had been seconded by representatives from all 5 founding families. I was reading the official record of my own death sentence. The next new moon was scheduled for the following week. I immediately began making copies of all the evidence I had gathered, storing digital files in multiple cloud accounts and mailing physical documents to my nephew in Dallas with instructions to contact law enforcement if anything happened to me. But I also knew that the founding families had been successfully covering up murders for 150 years, and they had significant influence over local law enforcement, medical examiners, and anyone else who might investigate suspicious deaths in Heritage Point. That weekend, I told my wife we needed to visit her sister in Oklahoma, planning to leave Heritage Point before the new moon and never return. But as we were packing our car Sunday evening, Mayor Brennan arrived at our house with Sheriff Morrison and Dr. Chen. "Lionel," Mayor Brennan said pleasantly, "we understand you've been working very hard on the historical project. Perhaps too hard. Dr. Chen thinks you might be suffering from stress-related paranoia that requires immediate medical attention." The 3 of them entered our house without invitation, and I realized they weren't planning to wait for the new moon. "We've decided it would be best if you took a break from the research," Sheriff Morrison explained. "Sometimes elderly people become confused when they spend too much time dwelling on the past. Dr. Brosti, Chen has some medication that will help you feel more relaxed." Dr. Chen opened his medical bag and withdrew a syringe filled with clear liquid. My wife, who hadn't been aware of what I'd discovered in my research, looked confused but not alarmed. She trusted these community leaders and didn't understand the danger we were in. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, backing toward our kitchen while trying to think of a way to escape or defend ourselves. "No misunderstanding," Mayor Brennan replied. "You've been very thorough in your research, Lionel. Too thorough. You've discovered information that certain families prefer to keep private. The historical record shows a remarkable pattern of success for Heritage Point's founding families," Dr. Chen added, approaching with a syringe. "That success has been maintained through careful attention to tradition." I grabbed a kitchen knife and threatened to call 911, but Sheriff Morrison just laughed. "Lionel, I am 911 in this town, and Dr. Chen will be the one who determines your cause of death. Just like his great-great-grandfather determined the cause of death for dozens of other people who asked too many questions. They forced the injection despite my resistance, and as consciousness faded, I heard them discussing how my death would be explained to the community. Heart attack brought on by stress," Dr. Chen said clinically. "Very common in men his age, who overexert themselves with ambitious projects. His wife will confirm that he'd been working too hard and seemed anxious lately. The Historical Archive project will be discontinued out of respect for Lionel's memory," Mayor Brennan added. "All research materials will be returned to the families they belong to." The last thing I remember was Sheriff Morrison saying, "Another successful conclusion. The traditions continue." I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Austin, where my nephew had brought me after receiving the evidence packages I'd mailed. The doctors said I'd been found unconscious in my car on a highway outside Heritage Point, apparently the victim of a hit-and-run accident that had left me with a severe concussion and temporary amnesia. My wife had been told I'd suffered a mental breakdown and driven away in confusion, leaving her behind. She'd been advised by Dr. Chen that my condition was irreversible, and she should consider moving closer to family members who could provide support during this difficult time. The evidence I'd gathered about the founding family's 150-year murder conspiracy was never formally investigated. Local authorities claimed the historical documents were obviously misinterpreted by an elderly man suffering from paranoid delusions, and federal investigators showed no interest in pursuing cases involving deaths that had occurred decades ago in a small Texas town. But my research had accomplished one thing. It had broken the pattern. For the first time in 6 generations, someone who had discovered the founding family's secret had survived to tell the story. The tradition of ritual murder, disguised as accidents, had been documented and exposed, even if official justice remained elusive. Heritage Point's founding families still control the town, and people who threaten their interests still die under suspicious circumstances during new moon periods. But now there's a record of their crimes. And someday, someone with more power than a retired history teacher will read that record and bring justice to the victims of Heritage Point's most deadly tradition. Sometimes the best way to fight monsters isn't to destroy them, but simply to make sure the world knows they exist. What if the calls coming into your late-night radio show weren't from the living? The voices on my overnight show in Whisper Falls began sharing memories of a disaster that happened 30 years ago, warning me that history was about to repeat itself, and I was the only one who could prevent hundreds of deaths. My name is Sonny, and at 26, I thought hosting the midnight to 6 shift at KWHI 96.3 FM would be a stepping stone to bigger markets and better opportunities in radio broadcasting. Whisper Falls, Washington sits in the Cascade Mountains, population 1,900, where winter storms regularly cut off road access, and radio becomes the lifeline connecting isolated residents to the outside world. The station served a 50-mile radius of small communities, logging camps, and mountain homesteads where people depended on overnight radio for weather updates, emergency information, and simple human connection during long, dark nights. KWHI had been broadcasting since 1962, operating out of a small building on the edge of town with equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. Station manager Harold Brennan hired me despite my limited experience, explaining that finding qualified people willing to work overnight shifts in such a remote location was nearly impossible. The midnight show is mostly music and weather, he explained during my interview. But you'll get call-ins from insomniacs, night shift workers, and folks who just need someone to talk to. It's community radio at its most essential. My first few weeks were exactly what Harold had described. I played classic rock and country music for truckers driving mountain highways, provided hourly weather updates for residents preparing for winter storms, and took calls from lonely people who needed friendly conversation during the dark hours before dawn. But gradually, I began receiving calls that didn't fit the normal pattern of overnight radio interaction. The first unusual call came during my third week on the job, around 2:30 a.m. during a particularly violent snowstorm that had knocked out power to several communities in the area. KWHI, you're on the air with Sunny, I announced, expecting the usual request for weather information or road conditions. Instead, I heard the voice of an elderly woman speaking with unusual urgency. "The dam," she said, without identifying herself. "You need to warn them about the dam. The ice is building up too fast, just like it did in 1994. The spillways can't handle the pressure when the spring melt starts." "Ma'am, which dam are you referring to?" I asked. But the line had already gone dead. I assumed she was talking about Whisper Lake Dam, a concrete structure built in the 1960s that created the reservoir supplying water to several communities in the valley. But according to recent engineering reports I'd seen in the local newspaper, the dam was in excellent condition and regularly inspected for safety issues. Over the following nights, I received similar calls from different voices, all of them older people who seemed intimately familiar with technical details about the dam's construction, maintenance history, and vulnerabilities that weren't common knowledge among general residents. "The drainage pipes are clogged with sediment," warned a man who called himself Thomas during a 3 a.m. snowstorm. Same problem we had 30 years ago, but nobody wanted to spend money on maintenance then either. "They didn't reinforce the spillway after the last inspection," added a woman named Margaret in a subsequent call. "The concrete has stress fractures that get worse every winter." I've seen this before. These callers spoke with the authority of engineers or long-term dam maintenance workers, but their voices had a strange quality that made them sound distant, as if they were speaking from very far away or through poor telephone connections. I began researching the history of Whisper Lake Dam, hoping to understand what these callers were referencing when they mentioned problems from 30 years ago. What I discovered in newspaper archives from 1994 made my blood run cold. On March 15, 1994, Whisper Lake Dam had suffered a catastrophic failure during spring snowmelt, sending a wall of water down the valley that destroyed 3 small communities and killed 127 people. The disaster had been caused by exactly the problems my mysterious callers were describing: clogged drainage systems, inadequate spillway capacity, and structural damage that had been ignored despite engineering warnings. The dam had been rebuilt with modern safety features and was supposedly designed to prevent any similar failures. But my callers seemed to believe that identical conditions were developing again. More disturbing was the discovery that many of my regular callers, Thomas, Margaret, and others who provided technical warnings about the dam, shared names with people who had died in the 1994 flood. According to victim lists from the disaster, Thomas Chen had been a dam maintenance supervisor who had filed multiple safety reports about structural problems in the months before the collapse. Margaret Morrison had been a civil engineer who had recommended immediate repairs that were deemed too expensive by town officials. Both of them had died when the flood destroyed their homes in the valley below the dam. I was receiving technical warnings about dam safety from people who had been dead for 30 years. But the calls continued night after night, with increasing urgency and more specific details about current conditions at Whisper Lake Dam that I couldn't verify through normal channels. The ice jam at the North Inlet is backing up water faster than the spillways can release it, warned a caller named Fletcher during a particularly intense storm in February. Spring temperatures are supposed to spike next week. When that ice breaks up all at once, the dam won't be able to handle the sudden volume increase. You need to get people evacuated from the valley communities, urged a woman named Betty in a follow-up call. Same weather pattern as 1994, cold winter with heavy snow accumulation, then rapid warming in March. The dam failed on March 15th last time. It's going to fail again on March 15th this year. I realized these weren't just random supernatural encounters. The spirits of the 1994 flood victims were trying to prevent the same disaster from happening again, using the radio station to warn the living about conditions they recognized from their final days alive. I faced an impossible dilemma. I couldn't officially warn the public about supernatural predictions without destroying my credibility and career. But I also couldn't ignore detailed technical warnings from people who had accurately predicted the previous dam failure. I decided to approach Harold Brennan about my concerns, hoping he might have insights into the dam's current condition or connections with local emergency management officials. Harold's reaction was more alarming than I had expected. "You need to stop taking those calls," he said immediately. "Don't put them on the air. Don't engage with them. Just hang up if you recognize those voices." "You know about them?" I asked, surprised by his familiarity with what I thought was my unique experience. "Every overnight DJ at this station has gotten those calls," Harold explained grimly. "They started right after we rebuilt the dam in 1995. The voices of people who died in the flood, trying to warn about another disaster. If they were right before, shouldn't we listen to them now?" I pressed. Harold's expression became deeply troubled. "Sonny, those people tried to prevent the 1994 disaster when they were alive. They filed reports, made recommendations, pushed for safety improvements. But town officials ignored them because the repairs were too expensive and the risk seemed manageable. So, history is repeating itself?" "Exactly. The same officials who ignored warnings 30 years ago are still in power, and they're making the same decisions for the same reasons. Economic concerns are outweighing safety considerations, just like they did in 1994. Harold revealed that he had tried multiple times over the years to get authorities to investigate the dam based on the supernatural warnings, but his efforts had been dismissed as the ravings of someone who spent too much time listening to ghost stories on late-night radio. "The spirits are right," he said sadly. "The dam is going to fail again, probably on March 15th, just like they predict. But nobody with the power to prevent it will listen to warnings from dead people, even when those dead people are the experts who understood the problem better than anyone." I spent the remaining weeks before March 15th documenting every call I received, recording detailed warnings about specific technical failures that the spirits predicted would cause the dam collapse. Their information was incredibly precise. Valve positions, water pressure readings, ice formation patterns, and structural stress points that no amateur could possibly understand. On March 10th, I received the most chilling call of all. "This is Thomas Chen," said the familiar voice of the dead maintenance supervisor. "We've done everything we can to warn you. The dam will fail in 5 days during the morning snowmelt surge. The same communities that were destroyed in 1994 will be destroyed again. But this time, you have advance warning." "What can I do?" I asked desperately. "Nobody will listen to supernatural predictions. Get them out, Thomas replied. Use your radio show to convince people to evacuate the valley, even if you can't tell them the real reason. Make up a story about road maintenance, utility work, anything that will get families away from the flood zone. How many people will die if I can't convince them to leave? More than last time, said Margaret Morrison's voice, joining the conversation. The valley communities have grown since 1994. If the dam fails and people are in their homes, we estimate 250 casualties. I spent March 11th through 14th using my radio show to promote a fictional emergency evacuation drill that I claimed was being conducted by county officials to test disaster response procedures. I urged residents of valley communities to participate by temporarily relocating to higher ground, treating it as a preparedness exercise for potential future emergencies. Some people listened. Many others ignored what they assumed was unnecessary government bureaucracy. On March 15th at 6:47 a.m., exactly as the spirits had predicted, Whisper Lake Dam suffered catastrophic failure during the morning snowmelt surge. The wall of water that roared down the valley destroyed the same communities that had been hit in 1994. But this time, only 37 people died instead of over 200. The families who had evacuated based on my fictional emergency drill owed their lives to warnings from people who had been dead for 30 years. I never returned to KWHI after the disaster. The psychological weight of communicating with spirits who were desperately trying to save the living from repeating their own tragic deaths was more than I could handle long term. But I learned something important about the nature of supernatural communication that night. Sometimes the dead don't haunt us out of malice or unfinished business. They haunt us out of love, trying to protect us from making the same mistakes that cost them their lives. The spirits of Whisper Falls found their voice through late-night radio, and their warnings saved over 160 lives that would have been lost if history had simply repeated itself without intervention. If these stories of small-town horror have captivated you, then you're exactly where you need to be. Part of the Verified Fears family. Subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell because every week I bring you more disturbing true encounters from the darkest corners of America that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the places we call home. Your subscription helps me continue investigating these hidden terrors and sharing the stories that others are too afraid to tell. Welcome to Verified Fears, where the truth is always more terrifying than fiction.